Good afternoon. There's something kind of funny about this. I don't know what it is. I think it's the music, and I feel like I should be singing now, but don't worry, I won't sing. My name's Doug Trevor. I have the pleasure of being on the faculty here in the Helen Zell Writers Program. And it's with a certain melancholy that I introduce Alice McDermott, who after just 4 days on our faculty has decided to go back to Johns Hopkins. Actually, Alice is this year's Zell Distinguished Fiction Writer in Residence. And boy, distinguished she is. Her novels include That Night, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, the PEN/Faulkner Award, and the Pulitzer Prize. At Weddings and Wakes, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Charming Billy, winner of the American Book Award and the National Book Award. After This, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Someone, which was longlisted for the National Book Award. Alice is no doubt, in the strictest sense of the word, a writer's writer. Someone whose sentences are precisely chiseled, someone who chooses technique over pyrotechnics, and someone who is equally adept at depicting experiences of loss and abandon, as she is moments of unexpected uplift and bemusement. There is, I have often thought, a Vermeer-like quality to her indelible scenes and vivid characters, Dutch portraiture, if, as I suppose we should expect on these shores, by way of New York. But Alice is also very much a reader's writer, one whose books are avidly consumed and commented upon by her many fans, one of whom declares in an Amazon comment on Someone I was looking at today, the following: "I will read every word this gifted woman has ever written." Alice is joined on stage by our own Eileen Pollack, author most recently of The Only Woman in the Room, Why Science is Still a Boys' Club, and the forthcoming novel, A Perfect Life. One last note. Please mark your calendars for the Hopwood Award ceremony and lecture next Tuesday, the 19th, in the Rackham Amphitheater on the 4th floor, where the author Susan Choi will speak, with a reception and a signing to follow around 5 p.m. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Alice McDermott and Eileen Pollack.
Thanks so much, Doug. Can everybody hear? Is this okay? So this is the first nice day in a long time, and you're all in here with us in a windowless room, but Alice will shed much light, so thanks for coming. I actually was the person on Amazon.com who wrote that I would. I just think I have the best job in the world, that part of my job is being asked to ask anything I want of really one of the writers whose work has meant so much to me and who's taught me so much about writing, and I'm not just saying that. So this is really fun for me. So I just wanted to start. So your book, That Night, was the first book I came to that and it completely blew me away. And one thing that I loved, for those of you who haven't read it, That Night takes place on a certain night in, was it the 50s, the 60s? It could really be either, in a sort of typical suburban neighborhood, middle class. It's told from the point of view of a younger girl who's fascinated by the older teenage girl next door, who's had this passionate affair with a teenage boy and gotten pregnant. So her mother separates them, won't let the boyfriend come. So he comes in a sort of caravan of jalopies with his guy friends, and they end up having a confrontation with the fathers in the neighborhood. And what I loved so much about it was that every detail just struck me as so right, that if you grew up at that time in that kind of neighborhood, that this was what it was like. The way the light was, what people said, the way girls talked about makeup, everything was perfect. But so it was very ordinary in a certain way, but it was also mythic. That to me, it felt like you had taken something about ordinary life and shown me what was larger in it, what was mythic. And so much of your work since then that I've read does the same thing. So someone takes what you call an ordinary woman's life and shows us what's really mythic in it. being jilted, marriage, childbirth. When you've been talking about some of that this week, you use the terms, oh, you just take a stereotype and go to town with it, the drunk, lovable Irish uncle. To me, you're dealing more with mythology, maybe the ordinary turned mythic, because there doesn't seem anything stereotypical in your work, you know. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that process works of actually going from the ordinary to this kind of mythic, to really give this dignity or largeness to ordinary life. Do you look for certain details that, you know, carry greater significance? Is it a moment in somebody's life? Are you looking at rites of passage? Are you thinking about, like, for a community or for America or for, you know, how does that work for you?
Well, thank you, Doug, and thank you everybody for being here out of the bright Michigan sun. I appreciate it. You know, just listening to your question, I guess I am reminded of the thing that fiction does that journalism and nonfiction does not do, and that is not simply report the details or report what has occurred, but to allow language to transform that very thing into something else altogether. And I think that's where we fiction writers, sort of lean more towards the poets aspirationally than we lean toward the nonfiction writers and reporters and journalists. So for me, it's not so much a matter of mythologizing what seems ordinary or looking for that detail that's somehow going to make the ordinary something else, but it's finding the right language for that thing that we all see. I mean, none of us who goes into this profession does so without being a reader first. I've heard writers say that, but they're liars. They're just saying that. So as a reader, that's what makes me want to be a writer. That notion that I've seen this scene, I've seen this character, I've heard this situation, I've gone by it day after day after day, and the writer found the language to make it something I have never seen before. And so it's the power of the written word, and it's also the effort of finding that language that will not just describe, but will somehow touch that vein of astonishment that we can't possibly live with. We can't go around being astonished at being alive. We would get nothing done. But I think we go to our writers to remind us, you know, stop for a minute, look, really see. Doesn't it take your breath away? And that's what language does.
Well, this is a little bit like saying, how do you get your magic to work? But how do you get, so it's a matter of, say, the voice or the somehow getting in the zone where you hear that language. Can you describe how voice works for you, say, when you're starting a novel and you're trying to find the voice? I think you spoke briefly about losing the voice and losing the pleasure of the writing and then coming back to it. How do you get the voice for a given novel? And do you try to have a different voice for each novel, or is it all right with you if two different narrators sound alike? How does voice work for you?
Well, it is certainly essential. It's hearing. I mean, it's not just the story you want to tell. It's who's telling the story. Whose eyes am I looking through? Is there a narrator? Is there someone who will direct the reader's gaze? But I guess, you know, since the beginning, and probably because it seemed like such a simple injunction at the time, I have very much taken to heart Joseph Conrad's advice that above all, make me see. And to take that sounds so easy. I'll be a writer, I can do that, you know. But when you work at that, and the effort it takes to, above all, make the reader see, immediately you are faced with being honest, authenticity. And you do have to, we were talking about this a little bit this afternoon, you do have to lock out of your workroom so many considerations that will distort the way you see. And one of them is everything else you've ever written. You know, because if I am sincerely struggling after only that, to make the reader see what I see or what a character sees, if I for a minute think, now does this sound like what I wrote before? Then the vision is distorted. So it is that sort of, it is a kind of amnesia that you have to teach yourself to do. You know, forget your friends, forget your readers, forget your critics, forget your husband, forget your children, forget all the things that brought you here, and put yourself at the service of your character. Which means discover the character's voice and the story that the character is going to tell. And even further, put yourself at the service of the language that will make the vision real.
Do any of the voices come from people you've actually heard speaking? Like, you know, or do the voices just come to you from, you don't quite know from where?
Well, I think it's, you know, I think story, character, and voice is really is so intricately tied. And again, I think if you are false about any one of them, if your intentions are toward anything, to impress, to imitate, you know, you're going to throw it off. You're going to lose. The magic's not going to happen. It may be brilliant and it may be funny, or it may be incisive, one of those favorite critical words, but it's not going to be true somehow. So it's what does the character need? What does the story need? And what do I have to do to provide that? So it's not so much an imitation. It's teaching yourself to hear.
So I have much more of an engineer's brain than a writer's brain. And so when I think about my own work, a story or a novel, I'm thinking a lot in terms of structure. And my students are thoroughly sick of hearing me talk about how you structure a story or a novel. But I just feel like if you don't know like what you're supposed to do or what makes a story, how do you know whether you have one? And I do this pretty traditional thing with the stupid triangle, you know, it's like an arc of desire or conflict. And I read online that you really don't think that way at all, which is great because I always like to make sure my students hear from normal writers who don't obsess about this like draw diagrams on the board. How do you think of, so I know you write novels more than stories, but I've enjoyed your stories too. So let's start with stories and we'll get to novels. What to you makes a story a story? Like, what gives it its shape so that you know, oh, this is a story?
You know, I wouldn't say I'm not interested in structure. As a matter of fact, I think structure is probably the piece I like best in the puzzle of it. And I guess maybe that's why I tend to be more of a novelist than a short, because there's just more to fool with in the story. I mean, back in my real youth, the first thing I wanted to be was a playwright. And the thing that I loved about plays was how they were structured. Where do you open? Where does the curtain come down? Act 1, Scene 1, where does it come up again? How does the last act, how can you find in the first act the last act?
Sure, it's even more structured than a novel or story.
Yeah,
it really is.
It's
like
helpful.
A screenplay.
Absolutely, and I love looking at plays with my fiction writers, you know, just for that. And also playwrights are really concerned about keeping people in their seats. And I think maybe writers should be a little more concerned about that as well. But so, no, I'm very interested in structure. And I guess I identify what's a novel more readily than I identify what's a short story. I still feel, novels just feel more elastic to me. And structure can be a little bit more unexpected. And maybe that's why I feel I really am a novelist. I do think, like, really great writers are poets, and really, really good writers are short story writers. And those of us who leave a little bit more room to kind of make mistakes, we're novelists. You know?
When you teach and your students write a short story, what do you look at to see whether it works for you as a story? Like, what do you tell them if it's not working? Like, well, you know.
Well, I mean, there's all kinds of things, you know. I mean, this is what I love about teaching. There really is no content to a course in creative writing, because the students, you know, provide the content. And so every story that a student brings to you is a new puzzle. You know, and some writers young writers know how to do one thing and don't know how to do another. I mean, I do talk often about just that basic, do I believe this? Mm-hmm. You know, are there logical connections here? Is there excess? You know, going back to the dramatist question of that basic question, what does the character want and how does the character go about getting it? You know, basic question of almost all literature. Can I see that in this story? You know, that's the fun part of it. But also that you don't want to put stories in a box and don't ever want to say every story must. It's every story must except for yours, you know, or you should never do this except when you do. You know, what's that great Flannery O'Connor, you know.
You can do anything you can get away with.
And you can't get away with much.
You can't get away with so much, yeah.
So for me, it's entry into a story, taking it seriously, living the life that a young writer has presented, and then saying, this is where I stopped believing, or this is where that felt like excess, or this is where I was really with you, and I don't know why I spent all this time not with you. Let's talk about that, you know? Here's where you seem to come into your own. Here's where your intentions for this story were all over the place. They're like, you know, like travel stickers, you know, this is what I want to do, and here's where the magic started happening, and you forgot your intentions, and your character came to life. So then we figure out structure. Well, then does that mean you get rid of that? Does that inform how you structure the next draft of the story? That's what's fun about it.
What about novels then, since that is what you do most? So I know every novel you have to figure out the structure afresh, but what guides you as you're figuring out the structure of a novel? Is it the span of somebody's life? Is it, I mean, what do you think of what guides you as you're trying to give it a shape and a kind of unity?
Again, I think it's different with every novel. I think at this point I am more comfortable with living with the mystery, both of what's the story and what's the ultimate structure going to be, than I was as a young writer. You know, I think that writing those outlines, you know, it's like, I know what I'm doing, you know, I see an ending, and then this will happen, and that will be really great, and then this will happen, and it's all connected. I think you tend to do that, you know, out of that sense of panic. At this stage of my career, I am more comfortable with saying I don't know, and I don't know until I write it. And it may be that I'll go to my desk this morning and I'll write something, and everything will change. There's a great line from Seamus Heaney in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech that was published. And he says it about poets, but I think it's really true about fiction writers, and especially about narrative. And he says, we must teach ourselves to walk on air against our better judgment. And I think that's the moment in writing where you say, you know, yeah, I needed to kid myself and say I know what this story is going to be about, and this is the thing that's getting me to that first chapter, and that. But at some point, you have to let go of those plans. It's the hardest thing to teach young writers. Let go of your plans. Just write for a while. Let the work of language stir your unconscious. The effort to say something true and authentic, not manipulated by plot, about a character or a situation or a place. Let that happen, and then go back and look at it and discover what you have taught yourself about your story. So that sense of, something I don't think we talk about enough when we talk about writing a long work is you've got to keep yourself interested in it, Before you worry about whether the reader's going to go from beginning to end, over the long haul, even if you're a really fast writer, it's going to be some months at least that you're going to be working with this material. And if you're just filling out lines, if you're just filling in the outline that you drew up, what fun is that? What does the suffering over language get you? But if the suffering over language then gets you to a story you didn't know you were going to tell, and that's as new for you and fresh and revealing as you hope it will be for the reader, then you're excited to get to your desk every morning.
Do you have any other ways of keeping up your excitement or getting back to your excitement or getting over a dead space in the years when you're working on a novel? Because I know I struggle with it, my students struggle with it. So you're trying to get to this scene you didn't know you would write. But for example, sometimes I'll just decide to write about something I love within the confines of the novel, because that'll sort of get me going again, or a place or something that meant a lot to me. Right. Do you have any go-to sort of like when you're just feeling that it's dead and you don't want to come to the desk the next morning?
Yeah, space break. Space break is a wonderful, wonderful tool. And again, I think sometimes what happens is for me, that's where my plans are overwhelming everything else. When you're writing that scene, here's the pivotal scene.
Because you have to write it.
Exactly.
Because you somehow planned that you have to write it.
Right. And sometimes you have to say to yourself, I know you've been thinking you're going to write that pivotal scene for 3 years now, and now it's time to write it. Maybe not. Or maybe write it in a sentence. Maybe it's not a scene. Maybe you can,
Sentence.
Yeah. Or again, space break. Try something else, move it somewhere else, move someplace you haven't been thinking about for the past 3 years. I think pretty much what you're saying too.
But that's interesting. I have actually never thought of that. Just space break, let's go somewhere else. I'm not happy here. Yeah.
Chapters. I remember going from being, a young writer who thought I wanted to be a short story, I thought I was a short story writer, just writing short stories, and then trying a novel and thinking, chapters are fabulous,
Because you can switch after
you can just drop everything you've written and start all over again.
That's so wonderful. I think I'm such a good girl. It's like if somebody says I should do something, I have to do it. And even if I'm the person who said I had to do it, I have to do it even though it's dead and terrible. You just say, forget it.
There's another quote that I'm always bombarding my students with. It's from Annie Dillard. And she says that the impulse to hold something back for later is the sign that you should write it right now.
Right now, yeah.
And especially young writers starting out with the novels, it's always that, and then on page 300, I am going to get to the best scene in the novel, and the reader's going to be so grateful because nothing has happened for 299 pages. Yeah. And then you say, well, start there. Right? And then, of course, it's the panic. If I write that, I got nothing. I got nothing. That's my scene. That's all I got. And that's where I hit them over the head with Seamus Heaney. That's when you walk on air. You write the thing that you're saving. That impulse to hold back is the sign that that's the first thing you should spend. And she goes on to say, the rest fills in from behind like well water. But it's it is tempting to say, let me, work around that. And you build up a scene in your mind And of course, it's never going to be as good as that. So move on.
Yeah, I think every MFA novel I've ever seen, the first time it was, oh, but that's going to happen, something's going to happen in the last chapter, and I'm building up to that, and you say, oh, no, that's going to be sort of the first chapter, and what happens
right. And then
after.
right. Leave your plans outside, and see what you have to say, because that comes back to voice. Right. You can't really rehearse voice away from your desk. You can kid yourself that you are, but voice really only happens when you actually choose each specific word in a sentence. That's the only time you can really clearly hear the voice. So you have to put your plans aside so that the words themselves can lead the way.
Did I read somewhere that you work on 2 novels at the same time?
Bad advice, don't do that.
How can you, I mean, when I'm working on one, it's all like, I mean, there's like the real world occasionally needs you to do, but your head is full of novel. How could you navigate real world novel and other novel? Do you work on one for a couple of weeks and then on the other? You don't do one in the morning and one in the evening.
No, it's really sloppy. It's not at all organized, and it never seems to be anything I actually choose to do.
Is it out of some other external demand, or are you afraid, like if you're working on one and it's not working, somehow you want to have something to go? Is that what it is?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's all those, not to psychoanalyze myself, which I try not to do. It's sometimes, I mean, I wrote my first novel, and I just wrote that novel, and it was when I was writing what was supposed to have been my second novel. I had already written enough of it that, I showed to my editor, and he was very happy, and we had the contract, and in that case, the characters were sort of starting to make these long reminiscing speeches about their childhoods, and it was wrong. It was not. I was losing control, and so I sort of stepped back and was not ready to abandon what I was writing. I had a contract. They'd already given me money for it, but I thought I need to write out. There's something going on in my life or whatever, and the characters are reflecting that. So I started writing what turned out to be that night, really to purge what I didn't know it was going to be a short story, but just to purge that sense of reminiscing, telling tales that somehow define, and worked on 2 for quite a while until then that night just sort of pulled ahead, and then so that's been sort of a habit that I've fallen into, a way of writing out or writing. But yes. Is there also a cowardly, fail-safe element to that? Absolutely. I remember the scariest moment, or one of the scariest moments of my time as a graduate student, as I overheard 2 very well-respected, published novelists speaking about a third up-and-coming novelist who had just published. It was either his second or third novel, and the 2 smart guys were saying to each other, his publisher took it from him too soon. And that just sent chills down. It's sort of like, like in childbirth, like, they took the baby too soon. It wasn't formed yet, And it scared the hell out of me. And I remember thinking, I never want to get to a point in my career when some publisher can take my novel away from me too soon. So I think maybe that, that sense of I've got 2 things going, and if one dies on the vine, which sometimes happens, or I don't have to publish it. I'm not going to be obliged to publish it. I can say, which I have to my long-suffering editor, we've been working together since day one, and I have so many times called him and said, that novel that you read that was under construction that you paid me for and put in the catalog even, that's not the one I'm going to write, But I think that's a lot of it, to also have that fail-safe to say, I don't need to finish. There are some things sometimes I don't need to finish. It's not going to be my best work, or I'm not I'm not the writer I was when I began it, but I don't want to start from ground zero again. So I have this other thing going. I'm sure that plays into it. But it's a really bad way to work because it means you take twice as long to write a novel because you're writing two.
Yes. Do you show your work to somebody before you show it to your editor? You don't? Wow. Now that would scare me. I have to show it to, I pull people off the street and ask them to read it. So you're just like, you're sure it's what you want it to be and you give it to your editor?
No,
but you trust your editor to do that?
Yeah, I sort of trust my editor. No, I know when I'm finished. I mean, I show him bits, mostly, well, I don't do that anymore, but early on, as I say, because we've worked together forever. And he bought my first novel when I had 100 pages of it. And I literally did not have page 101. So there was this scary moment of, oh my God, somebody has taken me seriously. And now I have to finish this novel. So over the years, while I'm working, I will sort of give him chunks just to sort of prove I am working. But we never talk about it under construction. And then when I know I've taken it to what appears to be its proper ending, that's when we'll talk.
Do you ever have to fight back against his suggestions? If you say no, does he just back off? Or?
No, he's had such a. It's really funny. My first agent, who's now retired, a woman named Harriet Wasserman. I'm just
very famous agent.
I mean, just one of the wisest, most unbelievable women I've ever known. When I was recommended to her, she asked if I had, a novel, and I showed her 50 pages. She said, "Do you have any more?" I said, "I have 50 more." She said, "Do you have any more?" And I said, literally, no. Maybe by tomorrow I'll have some more. And it was interesting because the first thing she said to me after she said, "Well, is there a house you would like to be published by? You're 27 years old and this is your first novel," and it's like, no, any house. But she said, "Would you like to work with a male or female editor?" Any editor. Literate is not even a requirement, And then she said very wisely, she said, "I'm going to send you to Jonathan Galassi, who's a young, up-and-coming editor, just made senior editor." And she said, "And I'm telling you why I'm going to send, because he's not a frustrated writer himself, and he'll leave you alone." And she was so right, because, at that point, another editor who said, "Hey, baby, I love these 100 pages, and I'll certainly publish them if you kill off the main character on page 130. I probably would have done it. Mm-hmm. I probably would have said, to get published, yes. So that's sort of been, all these years later, how we work. He's an editor who is respectful of writers and truly believes that the writer knows his or her own work better than anyone else.
Wow, that's, this so rarely happens anymore, that you get an editor like that, but also that you have that editor for your whole career. It's
yes,
just
it is.
really must be wonderful.
Really unusual, and probably because we leave each other alone. Maybe that's the
secret of marriage.
Secret
and
of a long marriage,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
So one thing I'm really interested in, a lot of you've been speaking this week about wanting to write books in which women's voices tell stories about women, and I love that. In a number of the books, you have a first-person narrator who's a woman who's telling a story that's only partly about herself. So in That Night, you have the girl next door telling Cheryl and Rick's story. In Charming Billy, you have that character you kept trying to get rid of, the niece, really, I guess it is, telling Billy's story, her father. And in some way, in someone, she's telling her own story, but she's really telling, the family story. And I read somewhere that you said, well, aren't women often the collective memory of a family or a neighborhood? Which is very interesting to me. So you have a female voice that's speaking and describing sort of a larger history or happen. Are you ever thinking of to whom is that voice speaking? So in terms of audience, are you thinking she's talking to other women, or she's talking to the men and explaining to them what women's love? So we have right in the first row Claire Vaye Watkins, who wrote a very wonderful, well-read essay about women writers not even realizing, especially when they're young, that whatever they're writing about, they have in their heads a male audience that they're trying to impress, to say, see, I can do the thing. You know, you alluded to it. You said something like, if you wrote about the husband and someone, you know, he's a man, he's been to war, I can show people I can do a man and war. How do you think about audience? Is it a woman speaking to other women, a woman speaking to men, to everybody? You don't think about it at all? I mean, does that
Yeah, I don't think about it at all is the closest to my experience. You know, I learned to be a reader and became a reader before the education system and English departments everywhere decided that kids and adolescents should be given books about themselves that they can relate to, that are similar experiences. Nobody ever thought to wonder if reading Dickens was going to speak to me as a kid growing up in Elmont. And I guess I still believe that. I feel like I'm I'm more writing to the collective unconscious, than to male or female or the critics who need to be impressed. I feel like I'm writing to other readers because I'm a reader, and that my characters are speaking to other readers. I mean, if I would be reluctant and probably actually not terribly interested in a book that I am writing in order to explain something. What the hell do I know? I'm only interested in, again, sort of that conjuring act that language can do to create character and situation and place, and essentially, you know, I suppose I still believe, essentially get to that moment where we can all say, yeah, that's us, you know, that's us. I mean, if I can read Lolita, for instance, and get to the end of Lolita and say, this horrible man, yeah, that's us, that's me. Then literature's done what I love literature to do. So that sort of targeted, you know. Outside of that, all those considerations are so valid. Yes, in the world outside of the place where art is created, all those things are valid. You know, the way women are read, the way they are interpreted and everything. But no, not in the purity of what we're all after, you know? That comes down to authenticity and to say something true.
So now I was going to ask something about bravery, because I think in many ways you're very brave. So when I read Child of My Heart, which is just one of my all-time favorite novels, you know, I love the writing and the characterization. So for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading it yet, it's about a 15-year-old girl on Long Island who's very beautiful and everybody loves her. She has a way with children, with animals. She's babysitting for the summer for a number of people, but especially for this artist who's 70 or so years old and has a wife. I don't know, it's his like 10th wife or whatever, but and she's taking care of her cousin. Spoiler alert, although knowing the plot doesn't really hinder your enjoyment. She realizes at some point what the adults don't, which is that her cousin is very sick, and decides not to tell anybody so that I guess the cousin can have. And at some point she has sex with the 70-year-old artist, all of which I found completely believable and wonderful and interesting, as do most people who read the novel. But if you go to the Amazon page, which some of us do on our own books, on other people are saying things like, I didn't think this girl was believable. And you would hear this in workshop all the time. No real 15-year-old girl I know would behave this way, as if that's the criterion. And they were just so upset that she had sex with the 70. It was disgusting, and why didn't you think of it as abuse? And because she doesn't seem to think of it as, she kind of, yeah. So I just wanted to ask you about sort of how you think about courage and maybe not caring what people think to a certain extent. My students, and when I was young, I cared very much. And we had a conversation in workshop the other day. I said, how many of you would have one character describe another as ugly? And they all just laughed, because no, it would be, you can't say that, You can't describe somebody's weight or, so how do we describe it? Maybe it's even sort of problematic to describe a character as attractive, because that objectifies somebody. There's so many things like that you would, what do you think of all that? Do you worry that somebody thinks that this 15-year-old having sex with the 70-year-old is really abuse, and if you don't couch it in those terms in your book, you've done something wrong, problematic?
Well, I don't read Amazon reviews. There's a start.
There's a start.
I think something, again, that I think it's sometimes difficult for readers to understand, because, essentially we are making this stuff up, and we do seem to be the gods of our own universe. And that you can write anything, if you're making it all up, anything can happen in your stories. But the fact is, the minute you write that first sentence, it's no longer true that anything can happen in your story. Add the second sentence, and even fewer things can happen in your story. And so the story begins to have its own authority by the way you have constructed it. For instance, in my novel After This, which is about a family, sort of getting through the 60s and the 70s, the impetus for it was just sort of a thematic thing. I was interested in raising children on my own, of my own. I was thinking about family as our first shelter, that play, and just that really typical, the parents hovering and all the things we want to protect our children from. And yet, we judge the success of a family by how it lets go. So that sort of sweet and difficult irony of family as first shelter, and yet must have its own destruction as an end, else other families don't form. So that was just something I was interested in. And I began the novel in a very literal way with a family, gathered young children, a wife is pregnant with the fourth, just a happy family with a hurricane coming in. And they end up in their basement, literally sheltering in their basement, and a tree falls, and father tells a story, blah, blah, blah. As the novel progressed, I did know I wanted to sort of follow these children and follow this couple, up to, and given the time frame of the novel, and I was also interested in, because the father was a World War II vet, and then and Encroaching Storm at the time was also Vietnam. So one of the kids was going to end up going to Vietnam, and he was going to die there. I did not want him to die there. I did not want to write a novel about a kid who goes to Vietnam and dies. I loved this character. He was the sweetest character. But when I was describing the shelter, the tree that falls was a willow tree. And that makes sense in the real world. Willows have shallow roots, and they were popular in the suburbs of that time. But willow trees are also the trees that are planted in cemeteries. A willow tree in literature, Ophelia is.
Oh, that's right.
I could have gone back and made it an oak, but I made the choice to make it a willow, and that tainted the water, so to speak. So to tell this story authentically, this story of this family sheltered, that became inevitable. And again, it's like, I talk to my non-writers friends, and it's like, that's such bullshit. You didn't have to kill. But the story is constructed so that at a certain point, you are not in control. So in the case of Child of My Heart, I was writing that just as the Catholic Church sex scandal was breaking. And here I am, ostensibly a Catholic writer, or at least labeled as that. And here I'm writing about, yes, of course it was child abuse. Of course a 15-year-old girl sleeping, even though she thinks she's doing it willingly. The guy's a creep, he's horrible. But everything about her character that had been in the book thus far, and everything about his character, and the way they had confronted and stood against each other. What she is saying is, I'm as much an artist as you are, old guy. And my artistry is what I do with these children. And my artistry is such that even this little cousin who I'm taking care of, who has clearly something wrong with her, I'm going to save her. I can create things that even you can't create. Having those two characters standing at opposite ends in this very short novel made that inevitable, that he would, given who he was, he would try to seduce her. But given who she was, she would not resist. But she would do it it's wrong, she's probably mistaken as a 15-year-old, but she might not be like any other 15-year-old.
Exactly,
She is.
That's why she's worth a novel, because
exactly,
she's not.
right. And it would be inauthentic and dishonest for me either because I'm afraid of what people will say, or because I find it distasteful myself. But the rules of the novel, even though I'm the one who devised the rules, at that point require a plot line to go a certain way. And you really are, you're helpless in some ways before it.
And for me, it made it a perfect book, because that all made such emotional sense to me. So if you'll bear with two more questions. So you are often thought of as, an Irish Catholic writer, and you write often about Irish Catholic communities in Brooklyn or wherever. And yet, you're not really writing about Irish identity or Irish American oppression. So I think it's interesting. I hope I get this right, but so I've worked with a lot of young writers who, if you're not writing from the American mainstream, white, male, straight, whatever, it's often hard. You get people expect you to be writing about your group and about identity and oppression, which many times is what people want to do, but many times it's not what the writer wants to do, but it gets read that way. And so what you're looking to do is have characters that you know and understand and are interested in. You're writing about something human, right? And the way it gets acted out is in a particular community. And there's some influence of, that the way it gets acted out, these characters are who they are, at least in part, because of their gender, their race, their nationality, their ethnicity. But that's not what the focus is. So there's a way in which I think if you're Irish Catholic, even if you're, Jewish American, that you have that freedom where people aren't just expecting it to be about, say, Irish identity or Irish oppression, but you're also, it affects who your characters are, who they are. So how do you think of that? Is it just, you said in the Q&A earlier today, well, I know these people, I know what food they'd be eating, right? I know what they'd be saying at dinner. Is it really just a matter of, like, you can make it authentic with these, it's a matter of character and place, or are there still ways, are there deeper ways in which religion or national heritage or historical experience is still really informing how that plot, how that circumstance, how what you're interested in gets worked out? Is there a deeper way that being Irish Catholic informs your work? Even though it's not about that, is what I guess I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I definitely. I think, this is why we need as many writers as we can get, because it's, everything, it passes through the artist's experience, and the same can be said of the characters. So yeah, I don't think that you can divorce the subject and those specific details from what the novel ultimately means. One of the best letters I ever got from anyone was after Charming Billy came out, and this man wrote to me and said, if you change all the surnames in this novel and change the alcohol to high cholesterol food, this is the story of my Jewish family. So it's more than alcohol and or high cholesterol food, and more than its surnames. But there is still something in the DNA, literally and figuratively, of the writer and of the characters that is significant. For me, I think Catholicism operates much more strongly than Irishness, but then the ethnicity, the Irish American stuff. But Catholicism does influence the way I see the world. It certainly influences the way my characters see the world, and probably most importantly, it provides my characters with a language. And so, given for me the primacy of the word, of the way things are put, the faith of my characters, not so much that I have anything of any interest to say about Catholic, or any desire to say anything about the institution of the Catholic Church or its history, but the language that it provides for my characters to give them a way to articulate what they cannot articulate is essential. And I can't separate those two things, and I'm not inclined to, I suppose.
Well, the last question is just, is there something that you think that you know now about writing, or being a writer, either the actual craft of it or the life of the writer, that you wish someone had told you when you were starting out, when you were, say, in your 20s? If you could speak back to young Alice. You said one thing, which was don't plan so much. You don't have to stick to the plan. Is there anything else you would tell that younger self?
Anything I told her would probably discourage her tremendously. I think it is. Certainly it's learning to let go and to sort of welcome the mystery. But I think it's also recognizing that whatever pleasure there is in this thing you must do, it comes in from the work itself. That there is, I know every young writer, and if I could just get one story published, then I'll know I'm a writer. Well, I got that. Well, maybe if I get two, well, maybe if I get a collection. Well, maybe if I publish a novel and then I'll know I'm a writer. Maybe if I publish a novel and it wins a big prize, then I'll know. You know.
And I'll be happy and confident, and the next one will be so easy, and people will treat me well and love me.
The real pleasure, if there is any, I mean, there's all kind, there's really no good reason to do this. You know, it batters your ego. You know, we're all uncertain, and we all feel fake and somehow pulling the wool over the world's eyes. You know, by anyone spending money to spend time with our words, all that kind of nonsense. But I mean, the pleasure really is in the work itself. It is in the hard work of writing that sentence and writing it again, and to paraphrase Philip Roth, turning it around, tossing it out and writing again. You know, that it's the work. Mm-hmm. And yes, of course, you want things to happen so that you have time to do the work. But just that to have the privilege to spend that time with this great, holy, mysterious thing called language, and to work in, you know, in obscurity or in fame. But day after day, in your small way, to work with language and to mine it for all the wonderful, unbelievably complex things it can do and the pleasures it can give. Like, that's as good as it's going to get.
Yeah, I would second that. So there's a lot of pleasure for all of you, because Alice's books are for sale upstairs, and I know she'll be willing to sign them. I'm sorry I didn't give you a chance to ask questions. We had that, I thought, at the Tuesday event, and I know I was just hogging her the whole time. But if we can show her our appreciation, and then I'm sure she'll answer some questions upstairs. Thanks so much.